Saraswati Namastubhyam Varade Kamarupini Vidyarambham Karishyami Siddhir Bhavatu Me Sada Shruti Smriti Purananam Alayam Karunalayam Namami Bhagavat Padam Shankaram Loka Shankaram Puranan Nyaya Mimamsa Dharma Shastranga Mishritaha Vedaha Sthanani Vidyanam Dharmasya cha Chaturdasha Ayurvedo Dhanurvedo Gandharvaschaiva te trayah Arthashastram Chaturthantu Vidyaha Ashtadashaiva tah. Om Shantihi Shantihi Shantihi. Namaste. I welcome everyone who has joined us today for another conversation brought to you by Indica's Center for Indic Studies in Law and Justice. In our conversation today, we have the renowned scholar, Professor Dr. Arvind Sharma. He has joined us today to speak on Hindu narratives on human rights. Now, this title is also the title of his book, Hindu Narratives on Human Rights. And that's the reason why it's the title of today's session. Now, this book has 16 chapters. I'm just going to read out some of the chapter names. Right to Justice, Does Hinduism Possess a Concept of Rights? Freedom of Religion, Hinduism and the Right to Property, Hinduism and the Right to Livelihood, Hinduism and the Right of Children, Marriage and the Rights of Women, Śakuntalā, Marriage and the Rights of Women, Sāvitrī, Animal Rights and Hinduism, and many, many wonderful topics like this, Hinduism and Egalitarianism, Hinduism and the Rights of the Dead, Human Rights, Human Dignity, and more. So this is a fascinating book and perhaps a pioneering one of its kind, focused on human rights at the intersection of human rights and Hinduism. And a little bit more about Professor Sharma, though he doesn't need an introduction in at least this part of the world, and people who are interested in these topics. Professor Sharma, who is formerly of the IAS, is currently the Burks Professor of Comparative Religion in the School of Religious Studies at McGill University in Montreal, Canada, where he has taught for over 30 years. He has also taught in Australia at the University of Queensland in Sydney, in the US at the Northeastern Boston Temple and Harvard, and in India at Nalanda. He has published extensively in the fields of comparative religion and Indian religions, and was instrumental in the adoption of a universal declaration of human rights by the world's religions through 3 global conferences on world's religions after September 11, which were held in Montreal in 3 different years, the latest being 2016. With that, I invite once again Professor Sharma warmly. Thank you for giving us this time and for joining us today, Professor Sharma.
Thank you, Kalyan Valvanji, for inviting me.
Wonderful. So to get started with our conversation today, I think it would really help the audience to understand, first of all, what motivated you to write a book on this topic, human rights, which is at the intersection of human rights and Hinduism. If you could help us understand that.
Yes, thanks for the question. The human rights discourse has become the language of moral discourse in our times. And I thought that we should participate in it from an Indic perspective. Excuse me. I hope as the discussion proceeds, the members of the audience will realize how the Indic religious traditions have something to offer to this moral discourse. So that was my primary motivation, yes.
Right. So as you see it, you see it becoming pretty much the moral discourse of the times that we live in. I think that's very well articulated and very well, that's a nice way to look at it. And therefore, having a participation from the Indic point of view and specifically Hindu point of view, okay, that makes sense. So how did you, help us understand a little bit more? How did you actually decide, for instance, that these are the topics that you would cover as part of human rights? When you're talking about human rights, you have 16 chapters in your book. If you could help us understand, was there an overarching framework that guided you, overarching human rights framework that you looked at, from which you then decided that these are the topics that one could write on? If you could help us understand how you approached this book writing, that would be perhaps very useful.
Well, several years ago, some decades ago actually, there was a project called Religion and Human Rights.
Okay.
It worked out of New York, and I was part of it. It
Okay.
was then that I became acquainted with Western positions on human rights in a major way.
Okay.
And I found that there were 3 phases in the development of human rights.
Right.
One in which there was an emphasis on just human rights. And then there was a phase in which women's rights and indigenous people's rights and others came to the fore. And then a third stage in which environmental rights came in the foreground. And there might be other ways of parsing this out, but thinking in the West along the lines of human rights evolved. And I was part of that process through this project. At the same time, I was also carrying out my studies in Hinduism and teaching classes on Hinduism. So it started becoming apparent to me that some of the material I was studying and teaching was relevant to the considerations which had come up during this project on religion and human rights. So that gave me the idea that perhaps we could write a few books from the Indic perspective on human rights. So there was the first book, I think, was just Hinduism and Human Rights. It was published by Oxford University Press in India. And I think that was followed by this Hindu narratives on human rights.
Okay, wonderful. So thank you for helping us understand that aspect. Now, did you have any other books to look up to at this intersection? I have searched and I haven't found at this specific intersection of Hinduism and human rights. Or is my understanding correct that it is actually pioneering in many ways what you have written?
It could be. I could not find much material on this. And at the same time, I found a lot of material in the Indic tradition, going at least as far back as the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad.
Right.
So I was struck by this gap, yes, in our knowledge of the subject.
Great. Yeah. Yeah, I remember in one of the references to dharma in Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, which beautifully, kind of articulates in some ways rule of law, right? And the importance of rule of law.
Exactly.
Correct. Yes. Correct. Great. So with this kind of a background on how your book evolved, starting with your motivations and the framework. Now I invite you to kind of share. Obviously, one talk of 30 minutes or 45 minutes is not going to do justice to the entire book. So I invite you to take up maybe the point or points or chapter or chapters that you feel you would like to discuss today, and which you think a broad audience who may not necessarily be academicians, could be a mix of people from different backgrounds. What, in your view, is the bare minimum that people should take away from your book? If you can help us understand that, that would be great.
Okay, thank you. What I'd like to do is to present 4 points.
Okay.
as emerging from the interface between the Indic religious traditions and human rights discourse.
Okay.
And so I'll discuss these 4 points, and then
Right.
we will have a discussion of these
Sure.
points through questions from the audience. Now, the
Okay.
first point I would like to make is that the current discourse on human rights has a tendency to emphasize civil and political rights over what might be called social and economic rights.
Okay.
And what do I mean by that? If today I stepped out of my house on the road and the police tried to arrest me, I could immediately ask for the warrant. On what basis are they trying to arrest me?
Right.
And if my arrest had no legal basis, then the human rights machinery in Canada could be easily activated in my defense.
Right.
Right? But if I was dying of hunger on my doorstep, such recourse is not available to me. Now, right to life is as important, I think, as the right to safety of person. But I think I regard it as very odd and almost obscene that if I am arrested without a warrant, I could activate the human rights machinery in my support, but I would not be able to do that if I am dying of hunger.
Right.
Now, the correction on this perspective is something which would be suggested by an Indic perspective of human rights discourse, where we have the tradition of kings. If there was a drought in the country, then the king would fast to show his sympathy with his subjects. That is, there has to be some clarity in the priorities in this matter. I think all of us would agree that my not suffering from hunger and dying from hunger should have priority as a right over my being arrested without a warrant. And human rights discourse has to recalibrate its priorities in this respect. This is the first point I would like to mention. The second point has to do with the concept of religious freedom. If we consult the Declaration of Human Rights on Religious Freedom, then it is embodied in Article 18 of that Universal Declaration. And it gives to every citizen the right to choose one's own religion, the right to freedom of conscience, belief, and faith, and also the right to change one's religion.
Right.
It does not, however, mention, at least with the same measure of emphasis, the right to retain one's religion. Now, this suggests a very important point to investigate, because it seems to assume, the view expressed in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights seems to assume that being a religion and being a missionary religion are convertible terms. That is, a religion by nature of being a religion is missionary. But this does not correspond to the facts in the field. We know that Christianity and Islam are proselytizing religions. But we also know that Hinduism, to a certain extent Buddhism, Jainism, Sikhism, Judaism, Confucianism, Taoism, Shinto, tribal religions, they are all non-proselytizing religions. And what is more, the proselytizing religions try to convert the people of the non-proselytizing religions to their own, which is an interference with the religious freedom of the followers of the non-proselytizing religion. Their freedom is compromised by the proselytizing zeal of the proselytizing religions. So human rights discourse on religious freedom must be very clear on this point, that people have as much a right, it is as much a right of the people to retain their religion as to change it.
Fascinating. Yeah, true.
This I would regard as the second point to pursue. The third point pertains to the fact that human rights discourse knows biography but no history. What do I mean by that? If my human rights have been compromised in this life, then I have remedies available to me. But suppose I am suffering from the fact that the human rights of my parents were compromised. And because of that, I am handicapped in certain ways.
Right.
That is to say, the concept of historical justice has not been covered in modern human rights discourse. This is a debatable point, whether they should be covered or not. But I think the debate is very important.
And by history, sorry to, may I just ask you a question over on the third point? Do you have a nuance on like what, when you say history, is it limited by this notion of until enlightenment within quotes, or do you mean historical in the sense of, long durée, really long durée?
What I'm trying to say is, I know there are great difficulties in implementing this idea, but they are not the kind of difficulties we do not have in relation to other ideas which we have implemented. I will give you an example. Let me give you an example. If I am killed, the courts can proceed against my assailant, right? Now you might raise the question, but there are so many murders being committed in the world. What about the justice to all those parties? And will giving justice to this man solve that problem? What I'm trying to suggest is that you could make out a strong, if superficial case, that my case can be taken casually because other cases have not been dealt with. I'm saying this in anticipating the criticism of historical rights. How far back will you go?
Right.
Well, let us begin with the immediate past.
Correct. Yeah.
Let us begin with the age of imperialism.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah.
Let us begin what was done to the Kenyans in the Mau Mau movement.
Absolutely. And in this context, this is a very interesting point, I think, on would you see the affirmative, what is called as affirmative action in India, which is also the reservations, isn't that also a form of a historical, to some extent at least, a historical correction? I'm not saying I'm not for or against it. I'm just trying to understand, isn't that already a case of how that justice is working?
Yes, and I appreciate your point immensely, because I would take the position that calling it social justice covers up the fact that it is really historical justice.
Right, right.
And
Understand.
that, yeah. You see, please consult the preamble to our Constitution. It speaks all sorts of justices,
Correct.
social, economic, and so on. But it does not use the word historical.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. I hear you completely. Correct.
And
Yeah.
that is something we should take into account and discuss. That was my third point.
Right.
My final point has to do, the fourth and final point has to do with the fact that Hindu ethical thinking, it seems to me, has been quite sensitive to the idea that ideas can come in conflict.
Mm.
We tend to overlook this in our normal ethical discourse. For instance, we love the battle cry of the French Revolution, equality, what else? Equality, fraternity, liberty. Right? Liberty, equality, fraternity. Okay. Now, we do not seem to realize that if we pursue liberty, it has the potential of compromising equality.
True.
You might wonder
True.
how. Well, you give freedom to everybody to develop economically. Some will become millionaires. What happened to equality? Somehow, we have not given adequate attention to the possibility that ideas can come in conflict, that rights can come in conflict.
Right.
Hindu ethical discourse has been quite sensitive to this on this point.
Right.
That they can come in conflict. And therefore, the suggestion has been that these issues should be resolved on a case-by-case basis.
Excellent. Yeah.
It does give us, it accepts the dynamic character of the situation. Dynamic and to a certain extent unpredictable nature of this problem. It cannot give us hard and fast rules because of this uncertain nature of the manner in which these conflicts will crop up. But it does lay down the general principle that the interest of the larger unit should prevail over the smaller unit. So there is this famous verse in the Mahabharata, Tejed ekam kulasyarthe. Gramasyarthe kulam tejed. Gramam janapadasyarthe. Atmarthe prithvim tejed. So give up the interest of the individual for the sake of the family. Of the family for the sake of the village. Of the village for the sake of the larger unit, the Janpada. I think human rights discourse would benefit from taking into account, critically of course, what Hindu ethical tradition has to offer to this dimension of human rights.
Understand. Wonderful. So, in fact, I think some might argue, well, let me not say some, but there is a view that group rights over this goes to the heart of, in some ways, to this debate on group rights versus individual rights, as though it is always a binary. Some cases it might be a binary, but increasingly it appears that it is played up as a binary with a very strong view on individual rights. And so almost the inversion of the progression that you actually shared right now. And I personally speaking, I see that I really appreciate the fact that you brought in the nuance of saying case by case, looking at every situation and then kind of evaluating what actually is required in that situation. That, I think, perhaps works more sensitively than having one rule that fits all for all situations, etc. So that's great. Now that you've given these four ideas, right? Four broad ideas. May I request you to kind of maybe, and for the fourth one, Hindu ethical thinking, you gave one example from the Mahabharata. If you want to add another instantiation for any of these ideas, maybe on religious freedom, you made this point about the right to retain, but from a historical point of view, is there anything that you want to share on any of these 4 points as examples that you would want from Hindu sources?
Yeah, okay. So let me share one additional point under the category of religious freedom, and one additional point when it comes to the conflict of human rights.
Right, okay.
So in the context of religious freedom, I would like to point out that there is a confusion in human rights discourse on the point of conversion, the right to convert. Right? The ambiguity which needs to be recognized here is that there is a difference, and this is what is not recognized in the discourse. There is a difference to be drawn, distinction to be made between my right to change my religion and somebody else's right to ask me to change my religion.
Bilkul, absolutely, yeah.
My right to change my religion is virtually unqualified. I think this accords with our moral intuition. But somebody else's right to ask me to change my religion cannot be unqualified in the same sense. Why should somebody else ask me to change my religion? Is it not an interference with my religious freedom? If I want to become a Muslim or a Christian, sure. But why should members of those community ask me to change my religion?
Correct. Yeah, I hear you.
There is an asymmetry there which has not been recognized sufficiently in human rights discourse. So this was the first point in the religious freedom. The other point I wish to make under the conflict of human rights is an example from Judaism.
Example from, I'm sorry?
From Judaism.
Yeah, from Judaism. Okay.
Judaism. So there are some people sitting in a boat in an ocean. And each person has a place demarcated for him on that boat, right?
Okay.
This is your part, this is my part. So I decide that this is my part. I'm going to drill a hole here in this boat. Now my right to do that now comes in conflict with the larger right of the people of the boat in terms of safety of the person. So clearly, in this case, my individual right has to be overridden by the group right.
Right. Right. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that most people, I think, would see the merit in that argument, I would
Yeah,
think.
so
Yeah.
this is a prima facie example of how the issue of individual rights and group rights has to be taken seriously.
Understand. And that is one area where you feel that there are instances in texts which are from the from Hindu sources, like Mahabharata, for instance, where we actually have clear articulation of how one supersedes. Now, we may not have exactly those structures today, but still, that emphasis is something that you have seen, and you think that is something that the
Yeah,
modern discourse can learn from. Correct?
if we look at the example from Judaism,
Mm.
if we take a look at the example from Judaism in the light of the Mahabharata verse,
Right.
we can say, Tejed ekam kulasyartse.
Right.
The right of the individual to drill the hole has to be given up for the
Right.
sake of the larger right of the group, the kul.
Right. I hear you. Right. So, on the point of my right to tell you to follow another religion vis-a-vis your right to kind of hold on to a religion, is that tension what you called as an under-researched or not sufficiently seen appreciated point? Do you see some parallels between that and what is called negative liberty and positive liberty, where negative liberty is perhaps less intrusive? It tells what the state cannot do, let people follow what they need to, whereas positive liberty is a kind of a normative prescription which is being done. Do you see a similarity between these points?
Well, it would, yeah, in terms of that distinction, we might argue that freedom of religion should be treated as a negative discourse in the sense that you freedom from conversion.
Correct.
Not
Right.
freedom for conversion would become a positive right.
Right. Absolutely. Right. Yeah. Correct. Great. Wonderful. Any other instance, any other topic that you would want to kind of let me actually word it this way. What do you think is severely under researched today at this intersection, and what would you perhaps, not many, but one or two topics that you would like youngsters who are interested in this area to kind of explore more based on your own study of how the response has been to your book and subsequent material that might have come, and your view of how this domain is developing? Would there be one or two topics that you think are burning, urgent areas where more attention needs to be focused?
Well, I would say that all the four areas I mentioned require more attention. I'm particularly interested in developing the idea of historical justice.
Right. Understand. Great. And is there new or work that you are actually working on any of these areas which is likely to come out in the future? I understand that you might not be able to share very specific details, but as one of the stalwarts in this area, it is always encouraging to know that there is more work which is actually being undertaken in this field.
Not on human rights as such, but I do have a book slated for release in summer.
Okay.
On the Manusmriti.
I see. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
The tentative title of the book is From Fire to Light.
From Fire to Light. Okay.
How to reread the Manusmriti.
Interesting. Yeah. Okay. Wonderful. And this, you said, is likely to come out later this year. Is that
This
right?
summer.
This summer.
This summer.
Okay, great. Wonderful. I look forward to purchasing a copy of that.
Yeah,
And
it is being published by HarperCollins in India.
okay, great. Wonderful. With that, if there's any other point that you would like to add, Dr. Sharma, I welcome that. And we could perhaps open it up to questions after that. If anybody who has listened to us so far have any specific questions to what Dr. Sharma has spoken about, I request you to please make sure that it is concise and specific to what he has spoken. And we'd be happy to read it out and Dr. Sharma can respond to it. But after any closing remarks that you might have, Professor, on this.
Oh, no, nothing sensational to offer by way of closing remarks. Let's just move on to the questions.
Okay, I understand. Yeah. So I see one question which is there currently in the Q&A box. Let me just get it up. So this is from a person called Yogi C. Shall I read it out, Professor Sharma?
Yes, please do.
It says, regarding religious freedom, wouldn't choice of religion include the retain aspect of religion? That is the question from Yogi. Should I repeat that question?
No, I think I understand the question now. Yes, the question is quite right, that the choice of religion should include that meaning, that implication. But if he consults the actual Article 18 in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, you will find that immediately after saying that one is free to, have whatever belief, etc. one wants to have, freedom of conscience and so on, it says this includes the right to change one's religion.
Right.
One did not say one has the right to change or retain one's religion. So that the immediate prospect which is offered to one is that there are these religions and you choose one of them. Well, but there is no thought given to the idea that a person may be happy with what one has. One need not make that choice. This is what I mean. Yeah. This is what I mean by saying that the conception of religion in modern human rights discourse has a missionary bias.
Understand. Great. Thank you. We have another question now from Ashwin Kumar. How would you respond to the following constraint? Okay, I think Ashwin Kumar is saying, give me a sec. Maybe he has not worded the question fully. So I'll just give him a few seconds to see if he wants to reword it. Because what we have on the screen seems incomplete. How would you respond to the following constraint? What rights do we have against arbitrary state action? That's all he has written. I'm afraid that is not complete. So what rights do we have against arbitrary state action?
No, that's a very good question. I would say that from one point of view, human rights discourse has come into being to protect the individual citizen from the arbitrary action of the state.
Right.
This is the subtext. What the questioner has expressed is the subtext of human rights discourse.
Right. Because Ashwin has specifically mentioned, give me a sec, and then he has written this. What rights do we have against state arbitrary action is the only way human rights can be rendered intelligible with a question mark. I am afraid that the second half doesn't, but yeah, I think you got what I think he was trying to ask, and
Yeah,
you see that as a subtext primarily of,
yeah,
of
yeah,
the discourse.
absolutely. Yeah.
Right.
You see, this
Okay.
is, I'd like to add something to that.
Sure.
I'd like to add something to that. If you go back to the Vedas Upanishad,
Right.
where the idea of dharma is raised, concept of dharma is brought into play,
Right.
in relation to a situation in which a weaker person overcomes a stronger person in a court of law.
Hmm.
Shankaracharya, while commenting on that, says, Kshatrasya aniyata shankaya. To protect against the danger of arbitrary action by the Kshatriya or the ruler.
Absolutely. Yeah.
It's very clearly articulated by Shankara. Yeah. In his commentary. Yeah? It's not in the text, it's in the commentary. Yeah.
Wonderful. Great. Next, it's an anonymous attendee. It's a slightly long, multiple questions, so I hope makes sense. Should we be referring to Sanatana Dharma as religion at all? As that classification itself is based on Western binary of secularism versus religion. Whereas ours is a knowledge system that gives knowledge about worldly and transcendental. Question mark.
Yeah, the answer is yes. We should not use the word religion to refer to dharma, because the word religion is a loaded term. It carries the load of Western civilization.
Understand. Yeah. The next question from the same person: should human rights be offering protection to our civilizational knowledge? Should human rights be offering protection to our civilizational knowledge?
Yes. Now we see some anticipation of this in the right of indigenous peoples, which has been asserted now in human rights discourse. And if we follow that lead, then the answer is yes.
Right. Okay. Then there is the same person who has followed it up by saying, as in the absence of that, we are forced to call Sanatana Dharma as a religion for the sake of getting protection. In the absence of human rights not protecting civilizational knowledge, the person is saying, the absence of that, we are forced to call Sanatana Dharma as a religion for the sake of getting protection. I guess what the person means is religions have protection, and therefore Sanatana Dharma is being called a religion so that some people can invoke that label to get some protection.
Now, this is a very delicate question.
Hmm.
The delicacy arises from the following point. In the Western legal framework, when you speak of religious freedom and the protection of religious rights, it is tied to a concept of religion. So when Hindus start saying that Hinduism is not a religion but a way of life, then in a Western context, they could be seen as handicapping themselves. Handicapping themselves, because then they fall outside the protective umbrella of the word religion. So this is a very delicate point. It is quite true to maintain that Hinduism is not a religion in the way the word religion is conceptualized in the West. But it deserves all the protections that a religion needs or requires, even though it may not conform to the traditional concept of what a religion is in terms of Western discourse. The danger is clearly illustrated by the manner in which the rights of the indigenous peoples of America have not been protected by legal discourse in America, because they were not considered as religion.
Bilkul. Understand. Yeah. So I'm mindful of time, and we have one more question. Perhaps we could take this as the last question, Professor Sharma. This is from Nakul Sharma. Isn't human rights a narrower lens to articulate the position of Sanatana Dharma, which espouses rights of all beings, including what is being popularized as rights of non-persons now?
This is a very fine point, and I have recently written a piece on how Hinduism or the Indic traditions believe in creaturely rights rather than just human rights, and it could be accessed on the first post.
Arvind, I'm just Googling that right away. First post, creaturely rights, to see if, let me see if I'm able to pull that up as we speak. Indic religious traditions and human rights. Is that the topic title?
Yeah, exactly.
Yes. Okay.
I have discussed this very in some detail.
Right. I think this is October 30th, 2022. Last October. Let me see if I can just put that in the chat box for people, for everyone, so people can access that. This is October 30th. It's called Dharma Files, Indic Religious Traditions and Human Rights. That's the title of the article in first post, which Professor was referring to. I've just put it in the chat box for people who want to access it. Great. So I, mindful of time, and also, I think we don't have any other question in the Q&A box right now. So thank you, Professor. I think this was a unique opportunity for me and for whoever who joined and who haven't heard you speak on this topic before, to get a sense of, how you got into this, why you think this needed to be done, what are some areas which you think are important, which of those are under-researched, and what more can be done in these areas, in addition to answering all these questions that we've had from people who joined in. Thank you for your time. I hope to have you back on our platform again, perhaps when your latest book is released. If not earlier, we could do another talk on the book on Manusmriti that you are writing on. So we could focus our conversation on that book once that is released. I hope we can do that. I wish you the very best for that book. Thank you so much for joining in.
That would be wonderful, and thanks for having me on your show. Goodbye now.
Namaste.
Namaste.
Thank you. Have a good Sunday.